just as a disclosure, so I am a paid consultant for angiodynamics, and the other aspect of this is that IRE is approved on a 510K soft tissue ablation. It does not have a specific pancreatic indication. So just so that you understand, we're talking about a broad use. For some of you all who are not familiar with IRE, really what we're talking about doing from an in situ and from an open surgical procedure is that it's an open midline incision and a locally advanced, in this case, pancreatic head tumor encasing the SMA and SMV. We're placing multiple needles that are bracketing that tumor as well as the vessels, and then providing very, very high voltage, very, very short pulses across those multiple probe pairs in order to induce permanent porosity and irreversible electroporation. And then once that treatment occurs, then through electrolyte disturbances, predominantly calcium coming into the cell, sodium leaving the cell, those cells then die over an approximate 8 to 10 week period of time. So it is not an immediate activity. It is an activity that we can treat, and then over that period of time, we get that cell death through apoptosis, and then most importantly, we get that cell repopulation across those vital structures. Very similar to the University of Miami, we have used a very similar type of algorithm on where IRE truly plays a role. We too believe, and I train physicians multiple times a year, that it really is about, obviously, that induction systemic chemotherapy. It goes without saying that I do not stand up here and say that IRE should be a first-line modality. We need to be using, obviously, active agents, either FOLFIRINOX or Gem/Abraxane within that 3 to 4, even 6 month period of time, based on the patient's tolerance and the ability to tolerate that therapy. And then utilizing that information to then potentially downsize patients who we are able to then go on and resect and then use IRE for margin accentuation. Or for the ones that are truly unresectable, then we will use an IRE in situ, i.e. without removing the tumor, and then use fairly standard adjuvant therapies of Gemzolota with or without radiation therapy based on that patient's clinical presentation and that underlying biology. As Peter mentioned, obviously we've gotten a strong foundation over our initial collaboration with 600 institutions, where we looked at 200 patients who had just had locally advanced. This did not include the borderline resectables, which obviously came out a little over 2 years ago in the Annals of Surgery. And the main aspect of that was obviously the overall survival. Interestingly enough, we also were able to confirm Christina Ferrone's data from MGH and Keith Lillimo, and that there is a overcall or an oversimplification, some types of preoperative imaging, such that when you get into the operating room, that true local advancement doesn't appear to be as locally advanced, and we can actually resect those patients. I think part of the reasons why is because IRE gives us something to fall back on. Even if we think someone is resectable, if we get in there and they're truly locally advanced, we don't just have to close. We can then convert them to an in situ IRE, and we too found that with approximately 50 of that 200 that we were able to then go on and resect, even though their preoperative imaging clearly made them a locally advanced based on imaging criteria. Prior to that Lancet Oncology article that Peter had mentioned, if you compare that to obviously standard systemic chemotherapy and radiation therapy, we were quite pleased in that we were obviously essentially doubling that overall survival. We weren't reaching the 5-year survival rates, and as you can see here, when patients recur, they clearly recur with a vengeance. We're not changing the biology of pancreatic cancer, and I don't stand up here to say that, but I think what we ultimately are doing are providing a consolidative therapy after standard chemotherapy so that we can potentially, at minimum, improve that disease-free survival, and then hopefully with even additional therapies or some of the novel therapies I'll touch on, really begin to translate that into improvement in overall survival long-term. If we look at the literature and we ultimately compare and evaluate the literature and the survival benefit and locally advanced pancreatic cancer, and this includes obviously predominantly standard of care, which are majority of these dots, which are obviously systemic chemotherapy or chemoradiation therapy. The size of the dot is basically based on the number of patients that were included in the study. And obviously the color of the dot is obviously based on the predominant modality. Majority of it all has obviously all been in blue, as that you can see here, with obviously the overall survival rates, even regardless of year, slowly increasing that we can see here from a trend of that aspect, but still hovering within that teens of overall survival. The two areas, obviously the University of Miami study and then obviously that study I just presented to you, has been showing that a median overall survival of out to 27.5 to 28 months is indeed achievable with combined multimodality therapy. Obviously, we clearly are not able to do this without the systemic response rates that we're getting with chemotherapy. Now, we are talking about surgery. And ultimately, if we look at that comparison, we look at the University of Miami, we look at the Ultimate Star Registry, which was that 200 patients, and then we compare that to that meta-analysis that came out of the Lancet Oncology. The only caveat and the one critique of that Lancet Oncology is that the median number of cycles of FOLFIRINOX that patients received was close to 15 to 16. I don't have a lot of those patients that can tolerate that much FOLFIRINOX. I'm excited when they can get 6 to 8 in at most. And so ultimately, this is not to discount the data that came out, but we need something else. We need something else for what I would classify as the majority of norm of patients who can't stay on systemic chemotherapy beyond 4 to 6 months. Dose-limiting toxicity is too much, their bone marrow gets tired, and they ultimately need the next line of consolidative therapy. The next critique is you're talking about surgery, Rob. You're talking about patients that we obviously never took to the operating room and you're assaulting them. I mean, obviously you're taking them to surgery. And so we've been very, very sensitive about that to obviously look at the significant toxicities. And it goes without saying, clearly systemic chemotherapy has toxicity and so does surgery. But if we look at actually specifically the grade 3 and 4 complications around whether you're doing it open or whether you're doing it percutaneously, they are essentially equivalent. And so what we're saying is that ultimately with the use of that advent of surgery, with is that between 2 to 5 day hospital stay, it's actually quite favorable than long-term continuous systemic chemotherapy. And so from that safety profile, we do believe that IRE doesn't add anything. It clearly has morbidity, and I don't mean to stand up here that it doesn't, but I don't believe that it's significantly worse than systemic chemotherapy. And so it's a collaborative effort that I think we can sort of get that type of benefit. Which then takes us to the registry. Approximately a year and a half ago, the AHPBA obviously entered into a collaborative agreement with Angio to monitor and run a prospective registry around the use of IRE in pancreatic malignancies. The main purpose of that is really ultimately to gain further insight into the selection. Who are the patients that are really being treated? What are the size of the tumors? What are the comorbidities? How much neoadjuvant chemo have they had? Are they all getting chemoradiation therapy? Given that there's still a wide range in treatment and therapeutics in the U.S. alone, that was the main goal of that. The other goal of that was also to capture what are the insights worldwide. And so we have sites in both Asia Pacific, China, Taiwan, as well as in Europe, and then soon to be obviously in Latin and South America, that we're going to be able to enroll into the registry to truly begin to understand what are the potential worldwide differences and obviously what are the potential synergistic aspects that we're seeing within this disease. The main goal of this is obviously to understand and gain that type of prospective data collection. What's the learning curve? We believe it's between 5 and 7 cases, but that may not be universal based on certain institutions and based on obviously certain referral biases. What are obviously the adverse events? Clearly, we want to make sure that that morbidity that you saw on the prior slide is maintained regardless of how many you're doing. My goal is to obviously make sure that the person who's doing 5 or 6 a year can clearly do them as well, as safe, and with the most effectiveness as someone who's doing more than 25 to 50 a year. Obviously, the ultimate aspect of it, this is not a data consortium to where we are taking your data and then have control of it. You have control of all of your data, and some of you in the audience have obviously been willing enough to start that collaboration, and I do say thank you for that. The way to participate is very easy. The AHPBA has just initiated, obviously, a website, AHPBAregistry.com, where all of that information is there. No one is excluded. If there is interest in collaboration, it is welcome at any time. I think the key thing about that, though, is that obviously it's all about safety and training, and ultimately you need to decide how you want to do things. There are really ultimately at least 2 or 3 different ways that IRE can be initiated. One is through a classic open surgical approach where the surgeon is placing the needles and doing it on their own. The other is a percutaneous approach to which there is clearly training and where University of Miami has been the leader of that. And then the other is a collaborative approach where an interventional radiologist is actually coming to the operating room and placing the needles in a collaborative effort for the surgeon. All of those access points and the use of that are welcome within the registry. Currently, we have 54 patients that are enrolled. Here is the list of the active sites. We have 9 active sites, majority of them within the U.S., obviously Freeman in the U.K., and then Tokyo University Hospital. Obviously, we have approximately another 5 or 6 that hope to come online in the next month, and our goal is to get to at least 100 patients in the next 6 months, so that hopefully this time next year I'll be able to present to you that interim safety and potentially even efficacy data around the use of IRE in this type of collaborative effort. As I mentioned before, all of this information, the protocol, the informed consent, it's open access. You do not have to sign anything to get it. We've obviously tried to make it very, very transparent. You're able to go onto the registry.com. This is the face page that you will see. The welcome packet here has all of that regulatory information. Take it. Do what you want with it. I'm happy to share it. This is not obviously something that we're trying to own. This is trying to make something very, very collaborative so that people can get more access and obviously collaboration with that. The other aspects, I do believe there's some benefit in trying to join. One, you're not going to be working alone. I have to admit, 8 years ago when I was out there and my chairman was like, I don't believe in this, Rob. I have no idea what you're doing. It was a sort of a lonely pathway in that there wasn't a lot of people doing it, and there was not a lot of commiseration or at least collaboration. That's also the main goal of the registry, is to truly join a collaborative group. We have been reviewing cases almost on a monthly basis based on certain sites, jumping on a quick go-to meeting, running through some images, going through some tips and tricks. Oh yeah, avoid this, be aware of this. Simply, honestly, so that your learning curve is a lot faster and sharper than mine. Mine was gradual. I have to admit it, because we were learning as we go because of the technology, but more so because of the biology and the consistency of the tissue. There's been a huge emphasis on training. Some of you all have obviously, hopefully, gained some access and some benefits from that. But the AHPBA has also realized that and have really tried to gain access to that. So this is now all freely available to the members. So this is on the members login page. If you're an AHPBA member, you will have free access to that, whether it be both ultrasound didactic courses to increase your skill set around ultrasound, how do you get better, but then most importantly, then there are multiple technique videos down here. How to do IRE in an in situ fashion, how to do an IRE for borderline resectable, what is the current algorithm and current consensus around the use of IRE. This is all freely available for anyone who's a member. Whether you want to be on the registry or not is really irrespective of that. You can have access to that and try and hopefully further gain additional transparency and an understanding of that as you either critically evaluate the technique or as you potentially become more facile in it and wanting to learn from that. It's a very high-end MedWorld Live type of imaging, which has multiple pictures in pictures, usually 3 or 4 different camera angles that you can switch through, whether the over the head or wide view, so you can really get some understanding of the true ultimate concepts of how to set up an IRE program and how to do it safely and effectively. The other aspect is about regulatory. And don't get me wrong, I think it's vitally important. For the people who are doing it, we need to understand what angiodynamics is obviously doing to improve upon that regulatory landscape. And they were able to get a 510K approval with this device on the exact same 510K as microwave and radio frequency. There's nothing similar to them, but they have the exact broad 510K. But that means we do not have a pancreatic indication. That is one of AngioDynamics' main goals. We finished a lot of the preclinical and the good laboratory practice or GLP animal studies in the last year to year and a half with a true goal of obviously filing for the FDA for a pancreatic indication, whether it be a pancreatic abnormality, pancreatic cancer, pancreatic tumor. That aspect is going through that iteration before that true underlying application goes to the FDA. So there's clear indication to try and obviously help us, help all of the oncology community to make sure that there is a true pancreatic organ indication. I'm going to switch gears now to second generation. For some of you all who may know, there is a technical demand with placing multiple needles. There's obviously a technical demand for making sure that we can place 3 and 4 needles in perfect parallel at perfect spacing. That can be a challenge, don't get me wrong. More importantly, the current generation is obviously close to 8 or 9 years old, that being the software platform, and it can be finicky depending on how long you're using it. And so this next generation device is going to have obviously a far more robust underlying processing speed aspect, so that obviously longer ablations are going to be able to be doing, and more importantly with an integrated cardiac gating system to make sure that it's all consistent. Probably the single thing is implementation of a single insertion device. There are clearly some times where it would be nice if you could get an honest 3.5 by 5.2 centimeter electroporation, that being both length and width, with a single insertion device. This device has also been optimized. A lot of preclinical work has been done and is finishing up in the early part of this year, with a hopefully access of this being in hopefully approximately a calendar year from now. This should be able to come online for us to use in certain malignancies. Clearly, not all cases will be accessible for a single insertion because the vital structures may be running right in the middle of it, but this will allow that type of flexibility in certain cases. I think it will dramatically improve the technical ability of this in some, because it's not going to demand as much multiple probes placed with perfect type of spacing. The other is obviously the true probe design. As you all know, or some of you all know, with truly being able to evaluate efficacy and truly knowing when you've reached that change in resistance endpoint, it can take a long time. The process has to finish, and then you have to review the imaging afterwards. It can be time consuming. Some IRE applications can be close to 45 minutes, and obviously it would be great if we could potentially improve upon that efficiency. This obviously device will allow you to obviously manipulate multiple probes. It's going to have a much more flexible sort of workflow to be able to work with the flexibility based on the probes that are there. It will also, obviously very similar in the past, but more robustly, be able to change voltages between 2 probe pairs and be able to manipulate that based on the tissue. The other aspect is to be able to then flexibly manage that. Reversing the polarity being one of them that sometimes can be very cumbersome, will be done in a real-time fashion and will allow an improvement in that. The other of that is also true the pulse generation, how many pulses you want to deliver, and be able to manipulate that per probe pair. What's critical right now is we have to use all probe pairs, we have to let it cycle through, and then only then can we make some changes. This is actually going to give us real-time changes in resistance in ohms, voltages, as well as amperages, depending on where your bias is. And as soon as that probe pair reaches that efficacious endpoint, you can then roll that probe pair off and then start the next probe pair. That has the ability of potentially cutting the overall energy delivery by almost in half, which I think will be a significant improvement in that, to giving us that type of flexibility and tracking that type of aspects. You'll be obviously having real-time minimum and maximum change in currents, so you'll be able to track ultimately the potential tissue changes that are occurring, which obviously can be challenging. Being able to change that mid-pulse is also going to allow a lot of efficiency. Now, ultimately, we have to stop the procedure, go back, and make changes. This will allow you to make all of those changes dynamically, which I think will help a lot for that. So there's a lot of exciting new things coming along, both from a regulatory standpoint, from a registry standpoint, and I think both new software and hardware that I think ultimately will make this procedure even easier for the end user, and more importantly, maintain that consistent safety and efficacy that you've seen. I thank you all for your time and attention, and I've left about a good 15, 20 minutes for questions, so I hope we can have some good discussion. Thank you.